Welcome back to A Clock in the Journal, where fear takes flight and shadows sharpen into steel. Tonight, we confront the dagger with wings from G.K. Chesterton's The Incredulity of Father Brown. A tale of curses and phantoms where a weapon seems alive with vengeance, yet Father Brown knows that the deadliest blade is often forged in the human heart. Father Brown, at one period of his life, found it difficult to hang his hat on a hat peg without repressing a slight shudder. The origin of this idiosyncrasy was indeed a mere detail in much more complicated events. But it was perhaps the only detail that remained to him in his busy life to remind him of the whole business. Its remote origin was to be found in the facts which led Dr. Boyne, the medical officer attached to the police force, to send for the priest on a particular frosty morning in December. Dr. Boyne was a big, dark Irishman, one of those rather baffling Irishmen to be found all over the world, who will talk scientific skepticism, materialism, and cynicism at length and at large, but who never dream of referring anything touching the ritual of religion to anything except the traditional religion of their native land. It would be hard to say whether their creed is a very superficial varnish or a very fundamental substratum, but most probably it is both, with a mass of materialism in between. Anyhow, when he thought that matters of that sort might be involved, he asked Father Brown to call, though he made no pretense of preference for that aspect of them. "I'm not sure I want you, was his greeting. "I'm not sure about anything yet. I'm hanged if I can make out whether it's a case for a doctor or a policeman or a priest." "Well," said Father Brown with a smile, "as I suppose you're both a policeman and a doctor, I seem to be rather in a minority." "I admit you're what politicians call an instructed minority," replied the doctor. "I mean, I know you've had to do a little in our line as well as your own, but it's precious hard to say whether this business is in your line or ours, or merely in the line of the commissioners in lunacy. We've just had a message from a man living near here, in that White House on the hill, asking for protection against a murderous persecution. We've gone into the facts as far as we could, and perhaps I'd better tell you the story as it is supposed to have happened, from the beginning. It seems that a man named Aylmer, who was a wealthy landowner in the West Country, married rather late in life and had 3 sons, Philip, Stephen, and Arnold. But in his bachelor days, when he thought he would have no heir, he had adopted a boy whom he thought very brilliant and promising, who went by the name of John Strake. His origin seems to be vague. They say he was a foundling. Some say he was a gypsy. I think the last notion is mixed up with the fact that Aylmer in his old age dabbled in all sorts of dingy occultism, including palmistry and astrology, and his 3 sons say that Strake encouraged him in it. But they said a great many other things besides that. They said Strake was an amazing scoundrel and especially an amazing liar, a genius in inventing lies on the spur of the moment and telling them so as to deceive a detective, but that might very well be a natural prejudice in the light of what happened. Perhaps you can more or less imagine what happened. The old man left practically everything to the adopted son, and when he died, the 3 real sons disputed the will. They said their father had been frightened into surrender, and, not to put too fine a point on it, into gibbering idiocy. They said Strake had the strangest and most cunning ways of getting at him, in spite of the nurses and the family, and terrorizing him on his deathbed. Anyhow, they seemed to have proved something about the dead man's mental condition, for the courts set aside the will and the sons inherited. Strake is said to have broken out in the most dreadful fashion, and sworn he would kill all 3 of them, one after another, and that nothing could hide them from his vengeance. It is the 3rd or last of the brothers, Arnold Aylmer, who is asking for police protection. "3rd and last," said the priest, looking at him gravely. "Yes," said Boyne, "the other 2 are dead." There was a silence before he continued. "That is where the doubt comes in. There is no proof they were murdered, but they might possibly have been. The eldest, who took up his position as squire, was supposed to have committed suicide in his garden. The second, who went into trade as a manufacturer, was knocked on the head by the machinery in his factory. He might very well have taken a false step and fallen, but if Strake did kill them, he is certainly very cunning in his way of getting to work and getting away. On the other hand, it's more than likely that the whole thing is a mania of conspiracy founded on a coincidence. Look here, what I want is this. I want somebody of sense, who isn't an official, to go up and have a talk with this Mr. Arnold Aylmer and form an impression of him. You know what a man with a delusion is like, and how a man looks when he is telling the truth. I want you to be the advance guard before we take the matter up." "It seems rather odd," said Father Brown, "that you haven't had to take it up before. If there is anything in this business, it seems to have been going on for a good time. Is there any particular reason why he should send for you just now, any more than any other time?" "That had occurred to me, as you may imagine," answered Dr. Boyne. "He does give a reason, but I confess it is one of the things that make me wonder whether the whole thing isn't only the whim of some half-witted crank. He declared that all his servants have suddenly gone on strike and left him, so that he is obliged to call on the police to look after his house. And on making inquiries, I certainly do find that there has been a general exodus of servants from that house on the hill, and of course the town is full of tales, very one-sided tales, I dare say. Their account of it seems to be that their employer had become quite impossible in his fidgets and fears and exactions, that he wanted them to guard the house like sentries, or sit up like night nurses in a hospital, that they could never be left alone, because he must never be left alone. So they all announced in a loud voice that he was a lunatic and left. Of course, that does not prove he is a lunatic, but it seems rather rum nowadays for a man to expect his valet or his parlour-maid to act as an armed guard. And so, said the priest with a smile, he wants a policeman to act as his parlour-maid because his parlour-maid won't act as a policeman. I thought that rather thick, too, agreed the doctor, but I can't take the responsibility of a flat refusal till I've tried a compromise. You are the compromise. Very well, said Father Brown simply. I'll go and call on him now if you like. The rolling country round the little town was sealed and bound with frost, and the sky was as clear and cold as steel, except in the northeast where clouds with lurid halos were beginning to climb up the sky. It was against these darker and more sinister colors that the house on the hill gleamed with a row of pale pillars, forming a short colonnade of the classical sort. A winding road led up to it across the curve of the down and plunged into a mass of dark bushes. Just before it reached the bushes, the air seemed to grow colder and colder, as if he were approaching an ice house or the North Pole. But he was a highly practical person, never entertaining such fancies except as fancies, and he merely cocked his eye at the great livid cloud crawling up over the house and remarked cheerfully, "It's going to snow." Through a low, ornamental iron gateway of the Italianate pattern, he entered a garden having something of that desolation which only belongs to the disorder of orderly things. Deep green growths were gray with the faint powder of the frost. Large weeds had fringed the fading pattern of the flower beds as if in a ragged frame, and the house stood as if waist-high in a stunted forest of shrubs and bushes. The vegetation consisted largely of evergreens or very hardy plants, and though it was thus thick and heavy, it was too northern to be called luxuriant. It might be described as an Arctic jungle. So it was in some sense with the house itself, which had a row of columns and a classical facade, which might have looked out on the Mediterranean, but which seemed now to be withering in the wind of the North Sea. Classical ornament here and there accentuated the contrast. Caryatides and carved masks of comedy or tragedy looked down from corners of the building upon the gray confusion of the garden paths, but the faces seemed to be frostbitten. The very volutes of the capitals might have curled up with the cold. Father Brown went up the grassy steps to a square porch flanked by big pillars and knocked at the door. About 4 minutes afterwards he knocked again. Then he stood still patiently, waiting with his back to the door, and looked out on the slowly darkening landscape. It was darkening under the shadow of that one great continent of cloud that had come flying out of the north, and even as he looked out beyond the pillars of the porch, which seemed huge and black above him in the twilight, he saw the opalescent crawling rim of the great cloud as it sailed over the roof and bowed over the porch like a canopy. The great canopy, with its faintly colored fringes, seemed to sink lower and lower upon the garden beyond, until what had recently been a clear and pale-hued winter sky was left in a few silver ribbons and rags like a sickly sunset. Father Brown waited, and there was no sound within. Then he betook himself briskly down the steps and round the house to look for another entrance. He eventually found one, a side door in the flat wall, and on this also he hammered, and outside this also he waited. Then he tried the handle, and found the door apparently bolted or fastened in some fashion, and then he moved along that side of the house, musing on the possibilities of the position, and wondering whether the eccentric Mr. Aylmer had barricaded himself too deep in the house to hear any kind of summons, or whether perhaps he would barricade himself all the more, on the assumption that any summons must be the challenge of the avenging Strake. It might be that the decamping servants had only unlocked one door when they left in the morning, and that their master had locked that. But whatever he might have done, it was unlikely that they, in the mood of that moment, had looked so carefully to the defenses. He continued his prowl round the place. It was not really a large place, though perhaps a little pretentious, and in a few moments he found he had made the complete circuit. A moment after he found what he suspected and sought. The French window of one room, curtained and shadowed with creeper, stood open by a crack, doubtless accidentally left ajar, and he found himself in a central room, comfortably upholstered in a rather old-fashioned way, with a staircase leading up from it on one side, and a door leading out of it on the other. Immediately opposite him was another door with red glass let into it, a little gaudily for later tastes, something that looked like a red-robed figure in cheap stained glass. On a round table to the right stood a sort of aquarium, a great bowl full of greenish water, in which fishes and similar things moved about as in a tank, and just opposite it a plant of the palm variety with very large green leaves. All this looked so very dusty and early Victorian that the telephone, visible in the curtained alcove, was almost a surprise. "Who is that?" a voice called out sharply and rather suspiciously from behind the stained glass door. "Could I see Mr. Aylmer?" asked the priest apologetically. The door opened, and a gentleman in a peacock green dressing gown came out with an inquiring look. His hair was rather rough and untidy, as if he had been in bed or lived in a state of slowly getting up, but his eyes were not only awake, but alert, and some would have said alarmed. Father Brown knew that the contradiction was likely enough in a man who had rather run to seed under the shadow either of a delusion or a danger. He had a fine aquiline face when seen in profile, but when seen full face the first impression was that of the untidiness and even the wilderness of his loose brown beard. "I am Mr. Aylmer," he said, "but I've got out of the way of expecting visitors." Something about Mr. Aylmer's unrestful eye prompted the priest to go straight to the point. If the man's persecution was only a monomania, he would be the less likely to resent it. "I was wondering," said Father Brown softly, "whether it is quite true that you never expect visitors." "You are right," replied his host steadily. "I always expect one visitor, and he may be the last." "I hope not," said Father Brown, "but at least I am relieved to infer that I do not look very like him." Mr. Aylmer shook himself with a sort of savage laugh. "You certainly do not," he said. "Mr. Aylmer," said Father Brown frankly, "I apologize for the liberty, but some friends of mine have told me about your trouble and asked me to see if I could do anything for you. The truth is, I have some little experience in affairs like this." "There are no affairs like this," said Aylmer. "You mean," observed Father Brown, "that the tragedies in your unfortunate family were not normal deaths?" "I mean, they were not even normal murders," answered the other. "The man who is hounding us all to death is a hellhound, and his power is from hell." "All evil has one origin," said the priest gravely. "But how do you know they were not normal murders?" Aylmer answered with a gesture which offered his guest a chair. Then he seated himself slowly in another, frowning, with his hands on his knees. But when he looked up, his expression had grown milder and more thoughtful, and his voice was quite cordial and composed. "Sir," he said, "I don't want you to imagine that I'm in the least an unreasonable person. I have come to these conclusions by reason, because unfortunately reason really leads there. I have read a great deal on these subjects, for I was the only one who inherited my father's scholarship in somewhat obscure matters, and I have since inherited his library. But what I tell you does not rest on what I have read, but on what I have seen." Father Brown nodded, and the other proceeded as if picking his words. "In my elder brother's case, I was not certain at first. There were no marks or footprints where he was found shot, and the pistol was left beside him. But he had just received a threatening letter, certainly from our enemy, for it was marked with a sign like a winged dagger, which was one of his infernal cabalistic tricks. And a servant said she had seen something moving along the garden wall in the twilight that was much too large to be a cat. I leave it there. All I can say is that if the murderer came, he managed to leave no traces of his coming. But when my brother Stephen died, it was different, and since then I have known. A machine was working in an open scaffolding under the factory tower. I scaled the platform a moment after he had fallen under the iron hammer that struck him. I did not see anything else strike him, but I saw what I saw. A great drift of factory smoke was rolling between me and the factory tower. But through a rift of it, I saw on the top of it a dark human figure wrapped in what looked like a black cloak. Then the sulphurous smoke drove between us again, and when it cleared, I looked up at the distant chimney. There was nobody there. I am a rational man, and I will ask all rational men how he had reached that dizzy, unapproachable turret, and how he left it." He stared across at the priest with a sphinx-like challenge. Then, after a silence, he said abruptly, "My brother's brains were knocked out, but his body was not much damaged. And in his pocket we found one of those warning messages dated the day before and stamped with the flying dagger. I am sure," he went on gravely, "that the symbol of the winged dagger is not merely arbitrary or accidental. Nothing about that abominable man is accidental. He is all design, though it is indeed a most dark and intricate design. His mind is woven not only out of elaborate schemes, but out of all sorts of secret languages and signs, and dumb signals and wordless pictures which are the names of nameless things. He is the worst sort of man that the world knows. He is the wicked mystic. Now, I don't pretend to penetrate all that is conveyed by this symbol, but it seems surely that it must have a relation to all that was most remarkable, or even incredible, in his movements as he had hovered round my unfortunate family. Is there no connection between the idea of a winged weapon and the mystery by which Philip was struck dead on his own lawn without the lightest touch of any footprint having disturbed the dust or grass? Is there no connection between the plumed poignard flying like a feathered arrow and that figure which hung on the far top of the toppling chimney, clad in a cloak for pinions?" "You mean," said Father Brown thoughtfully, "that he is in a perpetual state of levitation." "Simon Magus did it," replied Aylmer, "and it was one of the commonest predictions of the Dark Ages that Antichrist would be able to fly. Anyhow, there was the flying dagger on the document, and whether or no it could fly, it could certainly strike. Did you notice what sort of paper it was on?" asked Father Brown. "Common paper?" The sphinx-like face broke abruptly into a harsh laugh. "You can see what they're like," said Aylmer grimly, "for I got one myself this morning." He was leaning back in his chair now, with his long legs thrust out from under the green dressing-gown, which was a little short for him, and his bearded chin pillowed on his chest. Without moving otherwise, he thrust his hand deep in the dressing-gown pocket and held out a fluttering scrap of paper at the end of a rigid arm. His whole attitude was suggestive of a sort of paralysis that was both rigidity and collapse. But the next remark of the priest had a curious effect of rousing him. Father Brown was blinking in his short-sighted way at the paper presented to him. It was a singular sort of paper, rough without being common, as from an artist's sketchbook. And on it was drawn boldly in red ink a dagger decorated with wings like the rod of Hermes, with the written words, "Death comes the day after this as it came to your brothers." Father Brown tossed the paper on the floor and sat bolt upright in his chair. "You mustn't let that sort of stuff stupefy you," he said sharply. "These devils always try to make us helpless by making us hopeless." Rather to his surprise, an awakening wave went over the prostrate figure, which sprang from its chair as if startled out of a dream. You're right, cried Aylmer with a rather uncanny animation, and the devil shall find that I am not so hopeless after all, nor so helpless either. Perhaps I have more hope and better help than you fancy. He stood with his hands in his pockets, frowning down at the priest, who had a momentary doubt, during that strained silence, about whether the man's long peril had not touched his brain. But when he spoke, it was quite soberly. I believe my unfortunate brothers failed because they used the wrong weapons. Philip carried a revolver, and that was how his death came to be called suicide. Stephen had police protection, but he also had a sense of what made him ridiculous, and he could not allow a policeman to climb up a ladder after him to a scaffolding where he stood only a moment. They were both scoffers, reacting into skepticism from the strange mysticism of my father's last days. But I always knew there was more in my father than they understood. It is true that by studying magic he fell at last under the blight of black magic, the black magic of this scoundrel Strake. But my brothers were wrong about the antidote. The antidote to black magic is not brute materialism or worldly wisdom. The antidote to black magic is white magic. It rather depends, said Father Brown, what you mean by white magic. I mean silver magic, said the other, in a low voice, like one speaking of a secret revelation. Then, after a silence, he said, Do you know what I mean by silver magic? Excuse me a moment. He turned and opened the central door with the red glass and went into a passage beyond it. The house had less depth than Brown had supposed. Instead of the door opening into interior rooms, the corridor it revealed ended in another door on the garden. The door of one room was on one side of the passage. Doubtless, the priest told himself, the proprietor's bedroom, whence he had rushed out in his dressing gown. There was nothing else on that side but an ordinary hat stand with the ordinary dingy cluster of old hats and overcoats. But on the other side was something more interesting. A very dark old oak sideboard, laid out with some old silver and overhung by a trophy or ornament of old weapons. It was by that Arnold Aylmer halted, looking up at a long, antiquated pistol with a bell-shaped mouth. The door at the end of the passage was barely open, and through the crack came a streak of white daylight. The priest had very quick instincts about natural things, and something in the unusual brilliancy of that white line told him what had happened outside. It was indeed what he had prophesied when he was approaching the house. He ran past his rather startled host and opened the door, to face something that was at once a blank and a blaze. What he had seen shining through the crack was not only the most negative whiteness of daylight, but the positive whiteness of snow. All round, the sweeping fall of the country was covered with that shining pallor that seems at once hoary and innocent. Here is white magic anyhow, said Father Brown in his cheerful voice. Then, as he turned back into the hall, he murmured, And silver magic too, I suppose. For the white luster touched the silver with splendor and lit up the old steel here and there in the darkling armory. The shaggy head of the brooding Aylmer seemed to have a halo of silver fire as he turned with his face in shadow and the outlandish pistol in his hand. Do you know why I chose this sort of old blunderbuss? He asked. Because I can load it with this sort of bullet. He had picked up a small apostle's spoon from the sideboard and by sheer violence broke off the small figure at the top. Let us go back into the other room, he added. Did you ever read about the death of Dundee? He asked when they had reseated themselves. He had recovered from his momentary annoyance at the priest's restlessness. Graham of Claverhouse, who persecuted the Covenanters and had a black horse that could ride straight up a precipice. Don't you know he could only be shot with a silver bullet because he had sold himself to the devil? That's one comfort about you. At least you know enough to believe in the devil. Oh, yes, replied Father Brown. I believe in the devil. What I don't believe in is the Dundee. I mean the Dundee of Covenanting legends with his nightmare of a horse. John Graham was simply a 17th century professional soldier, rather better than most. If he dragooned them, it was because he was a dragoon, but not a dragon. Now my experience is that it's not that sort of swaggering blade who sells himself to the devil. The devil worshippers I've known were quite different. Not to mention names, which might cause a social flutter, I'll take a man in Dundee's own day. Have you ever heard of Dalrymple of Stair? No. replied the other gruffly. "You've heard of what he did," said Father Brown, "and it was worse than anything Dundee ever did. Yet he escapes the infamy by oblivion. He was the man who made the massacre of Glencoe. He was a very learned man and lucid lawyer, a statesman with very serious and enlarged ideas of statesmanship, a quiet man with a very refined and intellectual face. That's the sort of man who sells himself to the devil." Aylmer half started from his chair with an enthusiasm of eager assent. "By God, you are right," he cried. "A refined intellectual face. That is the face of John Strake." Then he raised himself and stood looking at the priest with a curious concentration. "If you will wait here a little while," he said, "I will show you something." He went back through the central door, closing it after him, going, the priest presumed, to the old sideboard, or possibly to his bedroom. Father Brown remained seated, gazing abstracted at the carpet, where a faint red glimmer shone from the glass in the doorway. Once it seemed to brighten like a ruby, and then darkened again, as if the sun of that stormy day had passed from cloud to cloud. Nothing moved except the aquatic creatures which floated to and fro in the dim green bowl. Father Brown was thinking hard. A minute or two afterwards he got up and slipped quietly to the alcove of the telephone, where he rang up his friend Dr. Boyne at the official headquarters. "I wanted to tell you about Aylmer and his affairs," he said quietly. "It's a queer story, but I rather think there's something in it. If I were you, I'd send some men up here straight away, 4 or 5 men, I think, and surround the house. If anything does happen, there'll probably be something startling in the way of an escape." Then he went back and sat down again, staring at the dark carpet, which again glowed blood red with the light from the glass door. Something in the filtered light set his mind drifting on certain borderlands of thought, with the first white daybreak before the coming of color, and all that mystery which is alternately veiled and revealed in the symbol of windows and of doors. An inhuman howl and a human voice came from beyond the closed doors, almost simultaneously with the noise of firing. Before the echoes of the shot had died away, the door was violently flung open, and his host staggered into the room, the dressing gown half torn from his shoulder and the long pistol smoking in his hand. He seemed to be shaking in every limb, yet he was shaken in part with an unnatural laughter. "Glory be to the white magic," he cried. "Glory be to the silver bullet. The hellhound had hunted once too often, and my brothers are avenged at last." He sank into a chair, and the pistol slid from his hand and fell on the floor. Father Brown darted past him, slipped through the glass door, and went down the passage. As he did so, he put his hand on the handle of the bedroom door, as if half intending to enter. Then he stooped a moment, as if examining something, and then he ran to the outer door and opened it. On the field of snow, which had been so blank a little while before, lay one black object. At the first glance it looked a little like an enormous bat. A second glance showed that it was, after all, a human figure, fallen on its face, the whole head covered by a broad black hat having something of a Latin American look, while the appearance of black wings came from the 2 flaps or loose sleeves of a very vast black cloak, spread out, perhaps by accident, to their utmost length on either side. Both the hands were hidden, though Father Brown thought he could detect the position of one of them, and saw close to it, under the edge of the cloak, the glimmer of some metallic weapon. The main effect, however, was curiously like that of the simple extravagances of heraldry, like a black eagle displayed on a white ground. But by walking round it and peering under the hat, the priest got a glimpse of the face, which was indeed what his host had called refined and intellectual, even skeptical and austere, the face of John Strake. "Well, I'm jiggered," muttered Father Brown. "It really does look like some vast vampire that has swooped down like a bird." "How else could he have come?" came a voice from the doorway, and Father Brown looked up to see Aylmer once more standing there. "Couldn't he have walked?" replied Father Brown evasively. Aylmer stretched out his arm and swept the white landscape with a gesture. "Look at the snow," he said in a deep voice that had a sort of roll and thrill in it. Is not the snow unspotted, pure as the white magic you yourself called it? Is there a speck on it for miles, save that one foul black blot that has fallen there? There are no footprints, but a few of yours and mine. There are none approaching the house from anywhere." Then he looked at the little priest for a moment with a concentrated and curious expression and said, "I will tell you something else. That cloak he flies with is too long to walk with. He was not a very tall man, and it would trail behind him like a royal train. Stretch it out over his body if you like, and see." "What happened to you both?" asked Father Brown abruptly. "It was too swift to describe," answered Aylmer. "I had looked out of the door and was turning back when there came a kind of rushing of wind all around me, as if I were being buffeted by a wheel revolving in mid-air. I spun round somehow and fired blindly, and then I saw nothing but what you see now, but I am morally certain that you wouldn't see it if I had not had a silver shot in my gun. It would have been a different body lying there in the snow." "By the way," remarked Father Brown, "shall we leave it lying there in the snow? Or would you like it taken into your room? I suppose that's your bedroom in the passage?" "No, no," replied Aylmer hastily. "We must leave it here till the police have seen it. Besides, I've had as much of such things as I can stand for the moment. Whatever else happens, I'm going to have a drink. After that, they can hang me if they like." Inside the central apartment, between the palm plant and the bowl of fishes, Aylmer tumbled into a chair. He had nearly knocked the bowl over as he lurched into the room, but he had managed to find the decanter of brandy after plunging his hand rather blindly into several cupboards and corners. He did not at any time look like a methodical person, but at this moment his distraction must have been extreme. He drank with a long gulp and began to talk rather feverishly, as if to fill up a silence. "I see you are still doubtful," he said, "though you have seen the thing with your own eyes. Believe me, there was something more behind the quarrel between the spirit of Strake and the spirit of the house of Aylmer. Besides, you have no business to be an unbeliever. You ought to stand for all the things these stupid people call superstitions. Come now, don't you think there's a lot in those old wives? Tales about luck and charms and so on, silver bullets included. What do you say about them as a Catholic?" "I say I'm an agnostic," replied Father Brown, smiling. "Nonsense," said Aylmer impatiently. "It's your business to believe things." "Well, I do believe some things, of course," conceded Father Brown, "and therefore, of course, I don't believe other things." Aylmer was leaning forward and looking at him with a strange intensity that was almost like that of a mesmerist. "You do believe it," he said. "You do believe everything. We all believe everything, even when we deny everything. The Denyers believe. The unbelievers believe. Don't you feel in your heart that these contradictions do not really contradict? That there is a cosmos that contains them all? The soul goes round upon a wheel of stars, and all things return. Perhaps Strake and I have striven in many shapes, beast against beast, and bird against bird, and perhaps we shall strive forever. But since we seek and need each other, even that eternal hatred is an eternal love. Good and evil go round in a wheel that is one thing and not many. Do you not realize in your heart, do you not believe behind all your beliefs, that there is but one reality and we are its shadows, and that all things are but aspects of one thing? A center where men melt into man and man into God? No," said Father Brown. Outside, twilight had begun to fall, in that phase of such a snow-laden evening when the land looks brighter than the sky. In the porch of the main entrance, visible through a half-curtained window, Father Brown could dimly see a bulky figure standing. He glanced casually at the French windows through which he had originally entered, and saw they were darkened with two equally motionless figures. The inner door with the colored glass stood slightly ajar, and he could see in the short corridor beyond the ends of two long shadows, exaggerated and distorted by the level light of evening, but still like gray caricatures of the figures of men. Dr. Boyne had already obeyed the telephone message. The house was surrounded. "What is the good of saying no?" insisted his host, still with the same hypnotic stare. "You have seen part of that eternal drama, with your own eyes. You have seen the threat of John Strake to slay Arnold Aylmer by black magic. You have seen Arnold Aylmer slay John Strake by white magic. You see Arnold Aylmer alive and talking to you now, and yet you don't believe it." "No, I do not believe it," said Father Brown, and rose from his chair like one terminating a visit. "Why not?" asked the other. The priest only lifted his voice a little, but it sounded in every corner of the room like a bell. "Because you are not Arnold Aylmer," he said. "I know who you are. Your name is John Strake, and you have murdered the last of the brothers, who is lying outside in the snow." A ring of white showed round the iris of the other man's eyes. He seemed to be making, with bursting eyeballs, a last effort to mesmerize and master his companion. Then he made a sudden movement sideways, and even as he did so, the door behind him opened, and a big detective in plain clothes put one hand quietly on his shoulder. The other hand hung down, but it held a revolver. The man looked wildly round, and saw plainclothesmen in all corners of the quiet room. That evening Father Brown had another and longer conversation with Dr. Boyne about the tragedy of the Aylmer family. By that time there was no longer any doubt of the central fact of the case, for John Strake had confessed his identity and even confessed his crimes. Only it would be truer to say that he boasted of his victories. Compared to the fact that he had rounded off his life's work with the last Aylmer lying dead, everything else, including existence itself, seemed to be indifferent to him. "The man is a sort of monomaniac," said Father Brown. "He is not interested in any other matter, not even in any other murder. I owe him something for that, for I had to comfort myself with the reflection a good many times this afternoon. As has doubtless occurred to you, instead of weaving all that wild but ingenious romance about winged vampires and silver bullets, he might have put an ordinary leaden bullet into me and walked out of the house. I assure you it occurred quite frequently to me." "I wonder why he didn't," observed Boyne. "I don't understand it, but I don't understand anything yet. How on earth did you discover it, and what in the world did you discover?" "Oh, you provided me with very valuable information," replied Father Brown modestly, "especially the one piece of information that really counted. I mean the statement that Strake was a very inventive and imaginative liar, with great presence of mind in producing his lies. This afternoon he needed it, but he rose to the occasion. Perhaps his only mistake was in choosing a preternatural story. He had the notion that because I am a clergyman, I should believe anything. Many people have little notions of that kind. But I can't make head or tail of it," said the doctor. "You must really begin at the beginning. The beginning of it was a dressing gown," said Father Brown simply. "It was the one really good disguise I've ever known. When you meet a man in a house with a dressing gown on, you assume quite automatically that he's in his own house. I assumed it myself, but afterwards queer little things began to happen. When he took the pistol down, he clicked it at arm's length, as a man does to make sure a strange weapon isn't loaded. Of course, he would know whether the pistols in his own hall were loaded or not. I didn't like the way he looked for the brandy, or the way he nearly barged into the bowl of fishes. For a man who has a fragile thing of that sort as a fixture in his rooms gets a quite mechanical habit of avoiding it. But these things might possibly have been fancies. The first real point was this. He came out from the little passage between the two doors, and in that passage there's only one other door leading to a room, so I assumed it was the bedroom he had just come from. I tried the handle, but it was locked. I thought this odd, and looked through the keyhole. It was an utterly bare room, obviously deserted. No bed, no anything. Therefore he had not come from inside any room, but from outside the house. And when I saw that, I think I saw the whole picture. Poor Arnold Aylmer doubtless slept and perhaps lived upstairs, and came down in his dressing gown and passed through the red glass door. At the end of the passage, black against the winter daylight, he saw the enemy of his house. He saw a tall, bearded man in a broad-brimmed black hat and a large, flapping black cloak. He did not see much more in this world. Strake sprang at him, throttling or stabbing him. We cannot be sure till the inquest. Then Strake, standing in the narrow passage between the hat stand and the old sideboard, and looking down in triumph on the last of his foes, heard something he had not expected. He heard footsteps in the parlor beyond. It was myself entering by the French windows. His masquerade was a miracle of promptitude. It involved not only a disguise, but a romance, an impromptu romance. He took off his big black hat and cloak and put on the dead man's dressing gown. Then he did a rather grisly thing, at least a thing that affects my fancy as more grisly than the rest. He hung the corpse like a coat on one of the hat pegs. He draped it in his own long cloak, and found it hung well below the heels. He covered the head entirely with his own white hat. It was the only possible way of hiding it in that little passage with the locked door, but it was really a very clever one. I myself walked past the hat stand once, without knowing it was anything but a hat stand. I think that unconsciousness of mine will always give me a shiver. He might perhaps have left it at that, but I might have discovered the corpse at any minute, and, hung where it was a corpse calling for what you might call an explanation. He adopted the bolder stroke of discovering it himself and explaining it himself. Then there dawned on this strange and frightfully fertile mind the conception of a story of substitution, the reversal of the parts. He had already assumed the part of Arnold Aylmer. Why should not his dead enemy assume the part of John Strake? There must have been something in that topsy-turvyism to take the fancy of that darkly fanciful man. It was like some frightful fancy-dress ball to which the two mortal enemies were to go dressed up as each other. Only the fancy-dress ball was to be a dance of death, and one of the dancers would be dead. That is why I can imagine that man putting it in his own mind, and I can imagine him smiling. Father Brown was gazing into vacancy with his large gray eyes, which, when not blurred by his trick of blinking, were the one notable thing in his face. He went on speaking simply and seriously. All things are from God, and above all, reason and imagination and the great gifts of the mind. They are good in themselves, and we must not altogether forget their origin, even in their perversion. Now this man had in him a very noble power to be perverted, the power of telling stories. He was a great novelist, only he had twisted his fictive power to practical and to evil ends, to deceiving men with false fact instead of with true fiction. It began with his deceiving old Aylmer with elaborate excuses and ingeniously detailed lies, but even that may have been, at the beginning, little more than the tall stories and taradiddles of the child who may say equally he has seen the King of England or the King of the Fairies. It grew strong in him through the vice that perpetuates all vices, pride. He grew more and more vain of his promptitude in producing stories, of his originality, and subtlety in developing them. That is what the young Aylmers meant by saying that he could always cast a spell over their father, and it was true. It was the sort of spell that the storyteller cast over the tyrant in the Arabian Nights, and to the last he walked the world with the pride of a poet, and with the false yet unfathomable courage of a great liar. He could always produce more Arabian Nights, if ever his neck was in danger, and today his neck was in danger. But I am sure, as I say, that he enjoyed it as a fantasy as well as a conspiracy. He set about the task of telling the true story the wrong way round, of treating the dead man as living and the live man as dead. He had already got into Aylmer's dressing gown. He proceeded to get into Aylmer's body and soul. He looked at the corpse, as if it were his own corpse lying cold in the snow. Then he eagled it in that strange fashion to suggest the sweeping descent of a bird of prey, and decked it out not only in his own dark and flying garments, but in a whole dark fairy tale about the black bird that could only fall by the silver bullet. I do not know whether it was the silver glittering on the sideboard, or the snow shining beyond the door that suggested to his intensely artistic temperament the theme of white magic and the white metal used against magicians. But whatever its origin, he made it his own like a poet, and did it very promptly like a practical man. He completed the exchange and reversal of parts by flinging the corpse out onto the snow as the corpse of Strake. He did his best to work up a creepy conception of Strake as something hovering in the air everywhere, a harpy with wings of speed and claws of death. to explain the absence of footprints and other things. For one piece of artistic impudence, I hugely admire him. He actually turned one of the contradictions in his case into an argument for it, and said that the man's cloak being too long for him proved that he never walked on the ground like an ordinary mortal. But he looked at me very hard while he said that, and something told me that he was at that moment trying a very big bluff. Dr. Boyne looked thoughtful. "Had you discovered the truth by then?" he asked. "There is something very queer and close to the nerves, I think, about notions affecting identity. I don't know whether it would be more weird to get a guess like that. Swiftly or slowly. I wonder when you suspected and when you were sure." "I think I really suspected when I telephoned to you," replied his friend. "And it was nothing more than the red light from the closed door brightening and darkening on the carpet. It looked like a splash of blood that grew vivid as it cried for vengeance. Why should it change like that? I knew the sun had not come out. It could only be because the second door behind it had been opened and shut on the garden. But if he had gone out and seen his enemy then, he would have raised the alarm then. And it was some time afterwards that the fracas occurred. I began to feel he had gone out to do something, to prepare something. But as to when I was certain, that is a different matter. I knew that right at the end he was trying to hypnotize me, to master me by the black art of eyes like talismans and a voice like an incantation. That's what he used to do with old Aylmer, no doubt. But it wasn't only the way he said it, it was what he said. It was the religion and philosophy of it. "I'm afraid I'm a practical man," said the doctor with gruff humor, "and I don't bother much about religion and philosophy." "You'll never be a practical man till you do," said Father Brown. "Look here, doctor, you know me pretty well. I think you know I'm not a bigot. You know I know there are all sorts in all religions, good men in bad ones and bad men in good ones. But there's just one little fact I've learned simply as a practical man. An entirely practical point that I've picked up by experience, like the tricks of an animal or the trademark of a good wine. I've scarcely ever met a criminal who philosophized at all, who didn't philosophize along those lines of Orientalism and recurrence and reincarnation, and the wheel of destiny and the serpent biting its own tail. I have found merely in practice that there is a curse on the servants of that serpent. On their belly shall they go, and the dust shall they eat. And there was never a blackguard or a profligate born who could not talk that sort of spirituality. It may not be like that in its real religious origins, but here in our working world it is the religion of rascals, and I knew it was a rascal who was speaking. "Why," said Boyne, "I should have thought that a rascal could pretty well profess any religion he chose." "Yes," assented the other. "He could profess any religion. That is, he could pretend to any religion if it was all a pretense. If it was mere mechanical hypocrisy and nothing else, no doubt it could be done by a mere mechanical hypocrite. Any sort of mask can be put on any sort of face. Anybody can learn certain phrases or state verbally that he holds certain views. I can go out into the street and state that I am a Wesleyan Methodist or a Sandemanian, though I fear in no very convincing accent. But we are talking about an artist, and for the enjoyment of the artist, the mask must be to some extent molded on the face. What he makes outside him must correspond to something inside him. He can only make his effects out of some of the materials of his soul. I suppose he could have said he was a Wesleyan Methodist, but he could never be an eloquent Methodist, as he can be an eloquent mystic and fatalist. I am talking of the sort of ideal such a man thinks of, if he really tries to be idealistic. It was his whole game with me to be as idealistic as possible, and whenever that is attempted by that sort of man, you will generally find it is that sort of ideal. That sort of man may be dripping with gore, but he will always be able to tell you quite sincerely that Buddhism is better than Christianity. Nay, he will tell you quite sincerely that Buddhism is more Christian than Christianity. That alone is enough to throw a hideous and ghastly ray of light on his notion of Christianity. "Upon my soul," said the doctor, laughing, "I can't make out whether you're denouncing or defending him." "It isn't defending a man to say he is a genius," said Father Brown. "Far from it. and it is simply a psychological fact that an artist will betray himself by some sort of sincerity. Leonardo da Vinci cannot draw as if he couldn't draw. Even if he tried, it will always be a strong parody of a weak thing. This man would have made something much too fearful and wonderful out of the Wesleyan Methodist. When the priest went forth again and set his face homeward, the cold had grown more intense, and yet was somehow intoxicating. The trees stood up like silver candelabra of some incredible cold Candlemas of purification. It was a piercing cold, like that silver sword of pure pain that once pierced the very he of purity. But it was not a killing cold, save in the sense of seeming to kill all the mortal obstructions to our immortal and immeasurable vitality. The pale green sky of twilight, with one star like the Star of Bethlehem, seemed by some strange contradiction to be a cavern of clarity. It was as if there could be a green furnace of cold which wakened all things to life like warmth, and that the deeper they went into those cold crystalline colors, the more were they light like winged creatures and clear like colored glass. It tingled with truth, and it divided truth from error with a blade like ice, but all that was left had never felt so much alive. It was as if all joy were a jewel in the heart of an iceberg. The priest hardly understood his own mood as he advanced deeper and deeper into the green gloaming, drinking deeper and deeper draughts of that virginal vivacity of the air. Some forgotten muddle and morbidity seemed to be left behind, or wiped out as the snow had painted out the footprints of the man of blood. As he shuffled homewards through the snow, he muttered to himself, "And yet he is right enough about there being a white magic, if he only knows where to look for it."